I am very excited to introduce our next keynote speaker, a gentleman who's been intimately involved with developing policy around coastal cities, specifically this one, and the Boston Harbor. As a federal judge, Richard Stearns oversaw the cleanup of the harbor and his deep knowledge of Boston's relationship with the sea. Please join me in welcoming Judge Stearns for his perspective on the fall, rise, and future of Boston Harbor.
You're walking away with my speech.
Oh, I did. I did not do that. You give me this part, and I'll give you, you can have that.
That would not
part.
be good if you left with this. It would be remiss for me not to begin with a word of remembrance to my friend, Mayor Menino. As you can imagine, as the mayor of a major city, he was a regular consumer of litigation services in my court. But over the years, he and I became very close friends outside of the court. I think he was interested in what I do because of an accident in litigation history some 15 years ago. I ended up with judicial oversight of the water system first in eastern Massachusetts and then the Boston Harbor cleanup after the death of my mentor, Judge Mazzoni. Why a federal judge should be running a sanitation engineering project, running is too strong a word, but even overseeing it, for those of you who are part of the international attendance of this audience, it would take another entire seminar to explain how American government could ever accomplish or allow a result like this. But that said, nonetheless, here I am. What the mayor asked me to, and he approached me about speaking at this conference some 5 or 6 months ago, was to speak about Boston Harbor specifically and its history and how the cleanup of Boston Harbor came about. And then, obviously, to tie it into the theme of this conference, what we have done trying to anticipate a problem that we do recognize, which is a rising sea level, a phenomenon that we've observed for almost a century now in the measured data that we have from the harbor itself. To tell you the story of Boston Harbor and to place it into context, you really have to go back a little bit in history. And some of this history was actually taught to me by Mayor Menino, who had an inexhaustible memory for historical lore about Boston itself. Now, the city itself was not incorporated until 1822, but it did function as a city prior to that. And in 1798 constituted its first Board of Health. Now, this is something I learned from the mayor, and it's a great trivia question that you can dine out for on a week. Who was the first commissioner of public health in Boston? It's a name you all know. Exactly. You're the first person I've ever seen who knew that, but Mayor Menino told me that. I didn't believe it, but I confirmed it. It was true. In the early part of Boston's history, the focus was not on disposing of waste. The focus was really on acquiring sources of fresh water. And there's a long story behind fresh water in Boston. Some of it is linked actually to New York. John Jarvis, who built the New York system, the unfiltered system in New York, actually was brought to Boston in the 1840s to sketch out a water plan for the metropolitan area of Boston. And if you go back to Jarvis's early notes, he conceived of what became the Wachusett Reservoir. Those notes were dug up later toward the end of the century by actually one of the greatest American civil engineers in history, who fortuitously had my name, Frederick Stearns, Rick Stearns, which is no relationship, but yeah, you only know him because he plays a cameo role in Chinatown. He was one of the people that Mulholland brought to Los Angeles to plot the stealing of water from the Owens Valley, if you follow the plot of Chinatown. But there, the Quabbin Reservoir was born, and the system then grew from these early plans that were laid in the 19th century. But freshwater was the focus toward the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. Waste disposal was something of an afterthought. The preferred method of the time was to use gravity and dump waste in the closest body of water you could find. Now, of course, in the case of Boston, that was the Boston Harbor. In a sense, we were a victim of very bad science. The best science in the 19th century would have told you that the most desirable way to dispose of waste was to use an ocean. We still do it on the west coast of the United States. But the State Board of Public Health, in its 1873 annual report on the state of health in Boston, was patting itself on the back for the sewage disposal system of the time, and said this: in the present state of human knowledge and experience, no better receptacle for sewage can be found than the ocean. Interesting enough, when that report was presented to the Boston City Council, Eric J. Dolan, who is the great eminent historian of the Boston Harbor and its cleanup, points out that only one city councilman raised any objection at all to the contamination that was the inevitable consequence of the sewage disposal system. What is also, I think, worth noting is that modern technology, as we say modern, really is pretty old. The basic principles of sanitary engineering, which would be sewer separation, precipitation, and manurization, those are our three legs of our stool, so to speak. That really was a clever pun, and I'm glad you got it. Have been frankly understood for 150 years, and were promoted in Boston by someone, a name you know, Lemuel Shattuck, who was one of the first to try to bring modern sanitation methods to Boston. But we were actually quite content to follow the plan that had not really been planned, but had just evolved in the 19th century, of just dumping more and more sewage into our harbor. By 1980, the Boston Public Harbor was judged the filthiest body of public water in the United States. Do you remember the Standells? Dirty water. It was still an emblematic theme at some in Fenway Park. But it's a song about the Charles River. Love that dirty water, which was a rock and roll hit, I think, in 1966. In 1988, in perhaps the second most effective campaign ad, or at least the third in political history, President George Bush used the harbor, unfairly, I think, although the portrayal is not necessarily inaccurate, but the portrayal of Governor Dukakis was. But nonetheless, used the harbor as a campaign theme in opposing the Dukakis nomination and in that race. And the slide that I have up, it's not a very good one because I took it as a still shot out of that campaign ad. I would show the whole ad, but it's kind of nauseating to see the ad itself and the visual images that were used in the ad to show what Boston Harbor actually looked like in 1988. What I did try to do, though, was go find and take a picture which shows roughly the same vantage, that same area of the harbor where the ad was filmed, and what Boston Harbor looks like today. But how we got there and how we got from one of the filthiest to one of the cleanest bodies of public water in the country in a matter of now some 25 years, I think is a story worthy of telling. 30 years might be a little bit better estimate of the time frame. The plan is not through. It's a 35-year plan. There are 2,439 days to go. I only know that because that's the day I promised Judge Mazzoni I would not retire until the plan got to its finish. So I actually know the number of days till until we get there. But an interesting thing, I think, happened. The demand for fresh water kept growing, and there were two reasons for that, to my mind. One is that you need to understand that in the early 19th century, our forebears were not very clean, and frankly, they didn't drink much water. Not very clean because indoor plumbing wasn't very common. Sources of fresh water were reasonably rare unless you were wealthy and could afford private water supply. And also, people didn't drink water because it was unsafe. And that was for centuries. Paul Lukacs, in his wonderful history of wine, points out that in the Middle Ages, most people went through life mildly drunk because everyone was afraid of water. And so it was, even though no one understood why it was unsafe, people learned that mixing alcohol with the water gave it some protection from common diseases. So it was far more common, which is why you read stories of Daniel Webster sitting down and downing 12 glasses of whiskey with his oysters. It's not because we were by natural state drunkards, but because whiskey or wine was seen as a much safer drink. I've always thought the temperance movement probably had something to do with the impulse to find more and more supplies of fresh water, because water now became an alternative to alcohol in people's minds. But what we did over the time is put in place a footprint of a sewage disposal system, which you can still see today if you follow the way the modern system is laid out. It essentially, and I'll describe it in just very simple terms, sewage was collected. It was then basically taken through a gravitational tunnel to Dorchester Bay, where the Neponset River inlet is. There was then an ingenious, it was considered an engineering marvel of its time, tunnel dug 142 feet below the bay. It was then taken out to Moon Island originally, and then Nut Island, where it was collected in giant reservoirs. And then, when the high tide receded and the tide began to go out, it was just simply released into the harbor itself. There was a conceptual flaw in the plan, which something that was not understood until much later, just that the harbor doesn't flush itself with each tide because of the islands. We have 34 islands that act as a barrier reef almost in the harbor. So on any given tidal cycle, only 17% of the harbor actually flushes itself. Well, if you're dumping, which we were at the time, 250 million gallons a day of raw sewage and 60 tons of sludge into the harbor, it doesn't take a degree in mathematics to see what is going to happen to the quality of the water in a very short period of time. And that's what happened to Boston. I only moved to Boston in 1973. But I did work in the area down near the harbor after that. And frankly, at the time, most of us were somewhat afraid of the harbor. It is not an exaggeration that in 1985, if you had slipped and fallen into the harbor for any period of time, you would have been taken immediately to the emergency room at New England Medical Center or Massachusetts General Hospital. The water was that dangerous and that contaminated. Nothing could live in it. It lost any particular value as a recreational resource for citizens of Boston, and it became forgotten. The best guidebook I think ever written to Massachusetts was the book written by the Works Progress Administration during the Depression in the 1930s, where a number of now, or later, very quite famous authors contributed chapters on every aspect of Massachusetts. You can still use it as a pretty good guidebook today if you want to tour the Mohawk Trail and the western part of the state or go up on the North Shore. A wonderful guidebook. What intrigues me about it is that in 500 pages, there is not one mention of the Boston Harbor or any one of the Boston Harbor Islands. Everything else is there, even to the granite quarries in Quincy, but not a mention of the harbor. The Of course, as the city turned from its maritime roots, another thing happened, which I think was unfortunate, although we eventually corrected it, and that was the Central Artery project. The Central Artery effectively erected a screen between Boston and the water. You didn't have to worry about the harbor any longer because you couldn't see it. There's very little activity at the harbor. Nobody had any reason to go near it. Might have been an occasional fish restaurant here and there, but I don't remember much by way of activity outside of the north end that was even close to the harbor itself. Still, people did recognize in government, they came slowly to recognize it, that something eventually was going to have to be done. So the Deer Island facility was then opened in 1952 to supplement Nut Island, and the idea was to begin providing some kind of at least primary treatment of sewage before it was dumped into the harbor itself. Well, the Nut Island plant never was able to cope with the amount that we were asking it to cope with, so it could never actually do anything more than remove the most obvious solids from the sewage it was receiving. Deer Island never worked because in one of those things that only government can do, somebody ordered the wrong size pumps that would not fit the intake pipes. And then, of course, the company that they bought the pumps from went bankrupt immediately thereafter, so they were never able to replace them. So all that was done at Deer Island was to precipitate sludge from what sewage, which was a lot that they were gathering. And then for reasons that totally elude me, once the sludge was collected, it was just simply dumped back into the harbor. So it could now redissolve into sludge again. So that really was the state that we were in when in and this is where the courts come in, and I'd like the story because I actually know all of the people who were involved in it at the time. But there was a young city solicitor in Quincy named Bill Golden, who was an avid jogger. I knew him because I was the chief prosecutor then in the Quincy District Court, and Bill was a public defender, so we squared off a number of times. Very, very smart guy. Later ran for lieutenant governor, if you remember. But he was an avid jogger and was out jogging on Wollaston Beach when he stepped on something that he thought was jellyfish and then realized it was human excrement and saw that the beach itself, he'd never jogged there before, was totally contaminated. So he brought a lawsuit then in the state superior court that the Conservation Law Foundation emulated. They filed a separate suit in federal court, and that was the suit that ended up with Judge Mazzoni. And to him, all the credit is owed. He was the master planner. He was an inspirational leader. He was the right person for a construction project of this size. He had been a foreman in a steel mill as a younger man. Also been, I think, one of the few All-American football players that Harvard University ever produced. He was 6 foot 6 inches tall, and just filled a room. And I know he was adored by, I know we have people here from the MWRA, at the MWRA as a completely visionary leader. But he is the one who put this plan in shape. The only thing I've done is tinker around the edges. Well, one piece was not so much tinkering, which was to approve the expansion of the plan to cover the tributaries. My view was that if we're going to clean the harbor, which we did, it didn't make much sense to keep collecting combined sewage overflow from the Mystic River, the Charles River, and the Neponset. So we did expand in 2006 the oversight of the plan to cover the tributaries, and I'll explain in a bit the progress that we've made in that regard. But this is how the case actually came into the hands of the federal court. By the time Judge Mazzoni got the case, Clean Water Act funds in the state had basically been exhausted. And so the only taxing mechanism that was feasible was a court fiat, which has been very unpopular. although historically I think the resentment is receding. If you are a ratepayer in Massachusetts, you have, since the court got involved, seen your water and sewer rates quadruple. We hope that we've reached the plateau. But an interesting phenomenon I find is that where in the early days I used to get bags full of mail from irate citizens every time there was an increase in the water rates, I haven't seen one now for 3 or 4 years. And I think the reason is that here is a massive construction project, $6 billion. It's still within the budget that was set in 1985. It is still on the timetable with some minor modifications that Judge Mazzoni set in 1987. As I said, within budget, and it is producing. I mean, this slide will show you, this is Judge Mazzoni, by the way. He'll come up here. And this is the Deer Island plant. This is where most of the modern processing, it's one of the more enlightened plants in the world, and it is and was designed to deal with sea level rise, as I'll explain in a minute. What has happened as the harbor improved, and this was Mayor Menino's vision and his reason for being such a friend of the harbor restoration project, is that his view was that if we could restore the harbor and make it fishable, make it swimmable, reopen the islands as a recreation destiny, not only for residents of Boston, but for visitors to the city, the development would follow. And what he had in mind at the time was the Seaport District. We used to call it South Boston, but someone decided that wasn't elegant enough. So we changed it to the Seaport District, and then we decided that wasn't elegant enough. So now we're the Innovation District. But somewhere between Innovation and Seaport, that is the area that was the South Boston waterfront. There, the growth has been phenomenal. Mayor Menino and Congressman Moakley urged the federal court to relocate on Fan Pier, which we did in 1998. And at the time, it was like Fort Apache. I mean, the courthouse was there, and there was really nothing until you got to the fish pier on that side, and then the Connolly Terminal way out at the far end of the expanse. Today, you wouldn't recognize the place. I mean, this morning, the mayor, again before he died, asked me to serve on the Transportation Planning Committee for this district. And so we've been watching the growth and studying how the growth is going to happen. We thought that we would see a build out of around 10 or 11 million new square feet of commercial space in the area by 2035 was the prediction. We're already at 14 million now, and expect it to reach 25 million within the next decade. Population, family units are being built as residential property is coming in. The population since 2000 has gone from 6,000 to 11,000. We expect, again, that to double in the next 10 or 15 years. So the growth has been exactly what Mayor Menino anticipated. If anything, I think he was pleased, Catherine, you would know, was probably thought it exceeded even his best expectations in terms of what would be accomplished. And I think a lot of the credit does go to the cleanup of the harbor. Just to give you an idea of what we've accomplished, and I'm being warned that I'm speaking too long, as judges always tend to do. But if I can give you some idea of what I think we've accomplished. Looking at the treatment figures, in 1987, this is when the MWRA took control of the plan that Judge Mazzoni put in place. And I'll just deal with what we call combined sewer overflow, which I think is a term all of you know. In 1987, we were putting 3.3 billion gallons of combined sewer overflow, only half of which got primary treatment, into Boston Harbor. Today, that figure has dropped to 0.5 billion gallons, of which 88% is now fully treated. And by the end of 2016, we'll take another 100 million gallons out of that, of which 93% of what goes into the harbor, again, will be fully treated. One of the great projects I've seen in my stewardship of the project is the North Dorchester Bay Storage Tunnel. This is a 2.1 mile long tunnel that we built from Union Park to the Connolly Terminal. It meant tunneling under South Boston, 17 foot in diameter. It holds 20 million gallons, which means that when we have the abnormal storm events, and this is one of the plans that we have for seawater rise, is that when we have storm surges, we can divert CSO into that tunnel rather than having to do, as we did, basically dumping it into the harbor. My law clerk cautioned me to stop saying "we" all the time because I'm supposed to be the neutral judge overseeing the litigation, and I get too enthusiastic about the results that I say and the job that I think the MWRA is doing. The MWRA, as a result of this tunnel, beach closings in Dorchester Bay and South Boston, which were averaging over 20 a year 5 years ago. The tunnel opened, fully effective 2 years ago. This year, how many beach closings did we have? None. Completely. So the beaches are now back. And this is not only good for residents of South Boston, for people in the inner city who can't afford the Cape or a vacation of any distance. They now have a beach that's actually within an MBTA ride from where they live. Of the 87 outfalls in the harbor, all 37 that were scheduled to be closed are now closed. So we feel that now we can contain and control any stress that we put on the system, even by a 50-year storm. A 100-year storm may be a different matter, but a 50-year storm, the system is well designed and could handle. So to get back to the topic of the conference today, sea level rise. I know, and I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to offer a scientific opinion. I know that there are margins of debate about the phenomenon. Is it occurring? Yes, it is, because we have hard data that shows that it's occurring. We've been measuring sea level in Boston Harbor since 1921, and up to 2013, I think there has been a rise of just a little under a foot, which sounds convincing to me because I read the New York figures, and that was exactly the figure in New York, was a 1 foot sea level rise in about the same period of time. I asked the MWRA if they had figures on storm events, which they do, at least from 1961 to the present. I was listening, and it pretty much confirms what I think a speaker on the last panel said. What I see in looking at the data is not a particularly statistically significant increase in the number of storms, but what does increase is their intensity and their duration. They're lasting much longer, and we're getting much more rain out of an individual storm event than would have been the case. The number is about the same. As I say, the intensity of the storms is growing. Planning, yes. Deer Island was built with a 100-year storm surge in mind. It's at an elevation that could easily survive a 100-year storm, and a storm surge at least equivalent to Hurricane Sandy in New York and worse. All of the water pumping facilities are now secured from flooding, unless, of course, everyone is. My assumption is that, and I think all planning, and Brian would know this, is built around at most a 2-year increase over the next century in sea level rise. That pretty much is the planning assumption that's being used. But the freshwater facilities are safe. The sewage facilities are safe, again, unless we have the 100-year storm, in which case I think there's just nothing you can do. The system will break down at that point. But all is risk in life, and it is people's money that you're spending, so you do have to make some very delicate judgments as between what is a risk that one can reasonably accommodate versus perhaps an overreaction to an event. Okay, this is, I'll conclude with this because I'd like you to know that we are doing some imaginative things. I always like to show this slide and ask where in northern New England it was taken. I don't know if anyone recognizes it. This is the back of the MBTA station in Alewife. This used to be a homeless encampment filled with abandoned shopping carts and heroin syringes. It is now, go sometime, it is now one of the most beautiful little parks that you've ever seen. What this is an oxbow. This is one of the small rivers that connects the Mystic and the Alewife Brook. And it's been bent into an oxbow. It's a natural remediation ground where water flows and cleans itself with New England plant life as it flows through. And to make the residents of Cambridge especially happy, park features were built in, including an amphitheater, bicycle paths, and jogging trails. But this is worth looking at. I think it shows what environmental imagination can do. So again, I'm now told I've used up all my time.